on his perspective. Neama, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, as always.
So this is interesting because it is another development in this saga, and I know that you and I had been speaking earlier when the Colorado ruling took place. Now, this is out of Maine. This is the first time that an election official has taken action. So is there any significance in that?
Well, there is, and it's slightly different. In Colorado, it was a district judge, which was a trial judge, that made the finding that Trump was an insurrectionist. Here, it is an elected official. Now, it did go through an administrative law process, but it still hasn't made its way through the Maine court. So it's going to have to go through the trial court and the Court of Appeals. And then, of course, the Maine Supreme Court, like the Colorado Supreme Court, has discretion whether to hear the case. But now that you're talking about two states that have, regardless of whether it's a judge or an elected official, found that Trump engaged in an insurrection, it's almost a certainty now that the Supreme Court has to take this case, and probably will do so maybe as early as its next conference in early January.
Now, I'm curious, so we now have Michigan, Colorado, Maine. Do you expect, and there are a number of other cases, do you expect a number of other states to now weigh in the coming week or so?
I do. The next state probably on deck is Oregon. California, my home state, the Secretary of State here and the governor has said that, Trump should remain on the ballot and these issues should be decided at the polls. And that's how a lot of Americans feel. They feel that this whole process, it's undemocratic, it's disenfranchising tens or even more than 100 million voters. But it's going to be interesting because the rulings across the country have been so inconsistent. And you alluded to some of them. In Michigan, for instance, the courts there ruled that, well, even though the 14th Amendment says that an official can't hold public office, that doesn't mean that they can't run for office. And in Minnesota, they said that this is a political issue that needs to be decided by Congress, not elected officials, state elected officials, or the courts.
And you mentioned that a number of states have already said, let the voters decide. Why not? Why not just let the voters decide? Why are courts weighing in?
The issue here is that no one knows how the 14th Amendment, Section 3 is enforced. Is it something that requires criminal charges and a conviction? Is it something that requires an act of Congress? And we know that Trump, even though he was impeached, he was acquitted during that Senate trial. Or can a lower level judge or even a Secretary of State make this decision? No one knows the answer to how the 14th Amendment is executed. And some people believe it's self-executing. Others believe there needs to be something more, a conviction and impeachment for it to go into effect.
Well, in Colorado's state Supreme Court, they were the very first to ever really use this clause in a case like this. Like you said, it seems that no one really knows how to navigate the clause. I would assume once and if the U.S. Supreme Court takes on this case, that would set the precedent for what this clause can and cannot be used for.
I think so. And, to be president, there's not really a whole lot of requirements. You need to be born in the United States, be at least 35 years old, and not have engaged in an insurrection. That's generally it. So it's pretty clear how old someone is and where they were born, but engaging in an insurrection, that's certainly less clear. And even folks who believe that Trump may have aided and abetted the Capitol riot, there are others that believe, well, unless you actually take up arms, enter the Capitol building, use violence against the United States government, that's not engaging in an insurrection, even though you might have encouraged others to do so. So there's so many different paths to victory for Donald Trump here. And obviously, we talked about, a Democratic Secretary of State in Maine. We talked about Colorado, where all of the justices, all 7 were appointed by Democratic governors. But the U.S. Supreme Court has a very different makeup. 6 conservative justices, 3 of whom were appointed by Trump himself. So it's a more favorable venue and so many different paths to victory. I would be surprised if the court didn't actually take this case and reverse it with some sort of clear guidance as to how we're going to proceed with respect to the 14th Amendment going forward.
And you mentioned Colorado. Colorado has now put Trump back on the ballot after state Republicans filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. So it seems apparently that Trump will be back on the Colorado ballot. What does that indicate, if anything?
Well, I think what the Secretary of State is doing is to try to force the Supreme Court's hand to hear the case. And what the Secretary of State in Colorado said is, look, if the U.S. Supreme Court declines to hear the case, we're going to remove Trump from the ballot because that means the Colorado Supreme Court decision stands. Or if the unlikely event that the U.S. Supreme Court affirms the Colorado Supreme Court decision, will also take him off the ballot. So I think what the Secretary of State there is trying to do is, and what we all really want is for the Supreme Court justices to step in, intervene, and resolve this issue once and for all. We can't have inconsistent rulings by judges and elected officials all over the country. I mean, it's constitutional chaos, and they're really the only ones who can fix this mess.
Constitutional chaos, absolutely. I think everyone wants clarity on this subject, and no doubt the justices understand that. So knowing that there is chaos involved in this system, how soon, and you mentioned very early in January, but I would imagine now, especially with Maine weighing in and likely other states, that time really is of the essence and they need to make an announcement of some sort soon.
They do. So the Supreme Court, just like every state Supreme Court, is a court of discretionary jurisdiction. They can choose what cases they hear and which ones they don't. And the way they make those decisions are at these conferences where the justices get together, they see all sorts of appeals that have come up, and they need to vote and decide which cases actually are accepted for review. And usually it requires 4 justices. Now, I believe the next Supreme Court conference, and of course these are secret, it's going to be in early January, maybe as soon as January 5th. So hopefully the court steps in, because this is something of extreme importance, and we can't have these lawsuits and decisions made on an ad hoc basis and inconsistently throughout the country.
Now I'm curious, because I am not the expert when it comes to these secret conferences. Could they, if they so chose, could they move up that conference date to discuss this matter because it has historic ramifications?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court makes its own rules. So the justices can get together. As long as they're all available, they could do it New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, or even today, make that decision and decide, are they going to accept this case? And although the Republicans in Colorado have appealed, Trump still himself has not appealed that ruling himself personally, but we expect him to do so as early as today, and that would trigger at least the possibility of the justices intervening and resolving this mess once and for all.
And you mentioned that Trump's attorneys have not yet filed that appeal. Why the wait? What is the strategy, if any, behind that?
I don't understand. Maybe they thought that, well, the Colorado Republican Party has already appealed, so they don't necessarily need to do so. Maybe they know that this is so important. They really want to make sure that that brief is perfect. You know, they dot their I's, cross their T's. But as long as the Supreme Court justices accept the case, they really have to do so within this term, because unless the oral argument is heard by about April, we're not going to get a decision before the November general election. So it's really important that the lawyers here get those briefs done, that the justices accept the case, because really time is of the essence. Now, a lot of folks watching might be, well, November is way out. But, you know, when it comes to appellate work, these cases can take months, if not longer. The parties have a briefing schedule. There will be opening briefs, replies. Sometimes there what's called a surreply, where they can reply to the opposition. And then there's oral argument, where, you know, we'll hear those appellate attorneys discuss the case with the justices, who have the right to ask questions. And then we'll see an opinion. And the opinion writing process can take a long time as well. So, you know, in the normal process, something might take years to get from a trial judge all the way to a state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court.
So it's interesting, because this really is, and we're all watching and experience this for the very first time. And you were mentioning, of course, that the court system, it's very thorough and it doesn't happen overnight. It could take months. So the question is, as we all wait and see what happens in the meantime, with these ballots, if certain states say yes, the former president can be on the ballot, and other states say no, he can't, what happens? Because I would imagine that that's very confusing to everyone.
It is. And, when these decisions come down, there's usually two possibilities. The first is sort of the normal process where the Colorado Supreme Court ruled that Trump can't be on the ballot, and he's not on the ballot unless a higher court, in which case the only higher court is the U.S. Supreme Court, says that the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong. That's the normal process. But what we're seeing with respect to Trump, because there's so many novel or new legal issues that have never been decided, there's no precedent for it, is that the courts are staying, which means pausing their decisions until the Supreme Court weighs in. So obviously we're seeing it here in Colorado with respect to the insurrection clause, but there's another important decision that's also stayed or put on hold, and that's the decision by Judge Chutkan, who's the judge in Washington, D.C., who's overseeing the federal election fraud case. And that has to do with presidential immunity and double jeopardy. So in that case, the judge said, well, the former president isn't immune from prosecution, and there's no double jeopardy issue, even though he was already charged in the House and acquitted in the Senate. But she said, I'm going to put my decision on hold and give the D.C. Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court the opportunity to weigh in. So what's happening in these cases is, even though Trump has lost, the decision really isn't going into effect because it's been put on pause while the appellate process plays out.
So interesting. And of course, we are watching history unfold live. Neama, before we let you go, is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers with the latest decision, with, what we can expect in the coming days and weeks regarding this issue?
I think just procedurally, the question is, are we going to have two appeals? Obviously, the Maine decision hasn't even gotten to the Maine trial court yet. So is the court going to just hear the Colorado case? Is it going to fast track the Maine one because it's really trailing behind? Is it going to consolidate the two cases? What's going to happen in Oregon? Because, now that that door is open with the Colorado Supreme Court, I wouldn't be surprised if other states, whether it's judges or secretaries of state, follow suit.
All right. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and really break down this historic event in the making.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be on.
All right. You are watching Live Now from Fox. I'm Stephanie.